A woman is dead. Her body was found stuffed in the trunk of a car in London, and the person accused of this crime, her own husband. Authorities in England believe Pankaj Lamba killed his wife, Harshita Brella, then fled the country. Police have made 2 arrests in this case, and when you learn who they are, it may shock you. I'll walk you through the details. For Law and Crime News, I'm Kennedi Walker. To understand how it all unfolded, we have to go back to November 2024. But before we get into this case, I want to tell you about something exciting at Law and Crime. We're launching a new channel called Scandal that is dedicated to exposing the dark side of fame, covering all the wild crimes in Hollywood and diving into the disturbing rumors floating around celebrity circles. To stay up to date on all the latest celebrity scandals, click in the link in the description of this video and subscribe to Scandal today. All right, back to the story. In the early hours of Thursday, November 14th, Northamptonshire police made a gruesome discovery: Brella's body, hidden inside the trunk of a car in London. This all started with a welfare check. Someone had called police earlier that day concerned about Harshita's whereabouts. When officers arrived at her home, they knocked, but no one answered. With no sign of her, police launched a missing persons investigation. Hours later, their search led them to a horrifying truth. Harshita was dead. A post-mortem exam confirmed she had been murdered. The cause of death was reportedly strangulation. From there, detectives worked around the clock to retrace her final moments, piecing together when and where she was killed. Soon after, police released a statement naming their prime suspect, her husband, Pankaj Lamba. They believe Lamba killed Harshita in Northamptonshire, transported her body more than 80 miles, then fled the country. At the time, more than 60 detectives were on the case, going door to door, scouring security footage and searching properties in an effort to reconstruct the crime. Police Chief Inspector Paul Cash described the circumstances surrounding Brella's murder as absolutely tragic.
Harshita was a young woman in her early 20s. She had a whole life ahead of her and everything to live for, and it is absolutely tragic that her life has been cut short in this way.
Not long after police discovered Harshita's body, her family broke their silence, expressing their grief. In a tribute, they said, quote, "Harshita, you left this world, but you are still with us in our hearts and will always be there. We will never forget you." The family revealed that Harshita and Lamba's marriage had been arranged, with their legal wedding taking place in August of 2023. Her sister Sonia told the BBC that the family sensed something was terribly wrong after Harshita's phone had been off for 2 days. As investigators worked to track down her killer, all eyes turned on Pankaj Lamba. With him officially named the prime suspect, authorities wasted no time launching an international manhunt. Detectives released images of Lamba and confirmed Harshita had been killed 4 days before her body was found. But this wasn't the first sign of trouble. According to reports obtained by the BBC, Harshita was reportedly a victim of domestic violence. Just months before her death, a domestic violence protection order was issued against Lamba. He had been arrested but was later released on bail. 4 police officers are currently being investigated and were handed disciplinary notices over their alleged handling of Harshita's domestic abuse report. The BBC reports the disciplinary notices are for gross misconduct and potential misconduct due to not following up with Harshita after her complaint. Harshita's father said, quote, "I want my son-in-law to be brought to justice, and I want my daughter's body brought home." Weeks later, that wish was granted. Harshita's body was sent back to her family in India. Time went on, and it seemed like Harshita's case had gone cold. Lamba was still missing, his whereabouts unknown. But now a stunning development: 2 arrests. Not Lamba himself, but his parents. Harshita's in-laws didn't live in the UK, they lived in India. Indian police arrested Darshan Singh and Sunil Devi, charging them under the country's dowry death law, a crime that carries a minimum 7-year prison sentence or even life in prison. According to India's legal code, a dowry death occurs when a woman suffers fatal injuries within 7 years of marriage and is proven that she was subjected to cruelty or harassment over dowry demands. Meanwhile, in the UK, Northamptonshire police continue to lead their own investigation, determined to find Lamba. For now, Pankaj Lamba remains on the run, but with authorities closing in, the question remains: how long can he hide? And joining me to talk more about this is Nick Brett, an attorney from the UK. Nick, thank you so much for coming on today. Let's just jump right in. From a legal standpoint, how difficult is it to prosecute a case when the suspect has fled the country?
Well, it's pretty difficult. The charges have been brought, and so he is wanted as a suspect. And what that means is, if he's outside the country, we're really reliant on some form of extradition agreement with the country in question to reach an agreement to bring him back if he can be apprehended there.
Now, legals do UK authorities face in trying to extradite Mr. Lamba if he's found in a country without an extradition treaty?
It's a good question. There is an extradition treaty between India and the UK, which dates back, I think, to the early 90s. I think there have been some question marks as to the effectiveness of that arrangement, both ways, and not just complaints from the UK, but also from India. It's not as simple an arrangement as it would be, for example, if we were dealing with suspects between the US and the UK, or even European countries and the UK, or other countries. But obviously, as you rightly point out, it depends first of all on him being arrested and identified in India.
If he is eventually found, what charges could he face in the UK and what kind of sentence would he be looking at?
Well, he's been charged. He has already been charged with murder. And also, I think, controlling coercive behaviour, and also sexual assaults and maybe rape. If he was convicted of the murder, so if he came back to the country and he was tried and found guilty of murder, he would receive a life sentence of imprisonment, which is mandatory over here for murder cases, which means he would serve. Technically, he could serve up to life in prison, and there would be a minimum period of time which he'd have to serve before he's considered for parole.
If he were found in India, could he be tried there or would he have to be extradited back to the UK?
I'm not sure about the answer to that question, whether or not in India they have any form of offence which relates to offences committed outside of India. I mean, certainly in this country, there are certain offences. Murder isn't one of them, but there are certain offences which we can try over here. Sex offences, for example, which are committed by sex offenders in, sometimes in the Far East, can be tried over here. So there are certainly there's certainly a basis to try foreign committed offences here, but I'm not sure what the situation is in India.
How common is it for a suspect's family members to be arrested in a case like this? And could that indicate law enforcement is closing in on him?
I think it does, and we had. I mean, it's quite interesting because this kind of situation in the UK is relatively common. That if offences are committed by people, generally from the subcontinent, that they flee back to the subcontinent. There was a quite high-profile case which was tried last year, in which a little girl was killed by her father, and he fled to Pakistan. And there was fairly, well, what I imagine was fairly strong diplomatic pressure placed on the Pakistani government, and he eventually was returned back to the UK and tried and convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. So it's not an uncommon situation.
Yeah, and we know that the police have charged his parents under India's dowry death law. I know that's in another country, but have you heard of things like this happening before?
I haven't. I mean, I don't have any in-depth knowledge of it. I certainly understand that the arrest is in relation to a sort of breach of dowry laws. I would imagine that there is probably diplomatic pressure that's been placed on the Indian government by the UK government in this case. I mean, it's a high-profile case. The police in this country will not want it to be a crime which is not brought to justice, and I imagine that behind the scenes, the government will be doing all they can with their Indian counterparts to ensure that the man is brought back to the UK and brought to justice.
Is there a possibility, again, I know this is India law, so you may not, be too familiar with it, but is it possible that if they do find the suspect, that they would release his parents from jail if it is some type of diplomatic pressure that's being placed on, India?
You, well, you would think so. I mean, it's difficult to know without knowing the intricacies of the sort of legal system over there. But as I say, I would imagine that if he's not found, or if he's found and has died, for example, committed suicide or something, then you would think that possibly they would be released from custody. I know there's also a sister who is wanted by the Indian authorities and is presently at large. And I think the family is from, I'm only going from what I read, but the family is from a fairly remote community in northern India, Chandigarh, I believe.
Yeah, I just know, like, when I read that, just knowing that, okay, their son committed, allegedly committed this crime, and then they got arrested. I know a lot of people, were confused or, not really understanding.
Yeah.
Just also wondering, if they are, if the parents are convicted under the dowry death law, could that potentially impact his case in the UK, or it doesn't have anything to do with
I
it?
wouldn't think so. No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, one would expect there to be. I mean, I think that the police over here. I mean, there's obviously been a police investigation that's happened in November last year. There's a police investigation been going on for the last 4 or 5 months. I mean, I think the police believe that she was strangled and put in the back of a car and driven by him to East London, where she was subsequently discovered. I mean, in murder investigations of this nature, usually quite a considerable amount of resources spent on forensic investigation, for example, and also the viewing of CCTV. So whilst one wouldn't read the intricacies of the evidence pre-trial because they'd be concerned about prejudice, one would expect there to have been fairly extensive investigation, and that the strength of the evidence points towards him having committed the crime. And I think there's some background issues with respect to him having been reported for domestic violence previously. And, so consequently, I wouldn't imagine that his parents and what's happened to his parents would necessarily affect his position over here, were he to be extradited over here to face trial, but more that, the case would be based upon the forensic and other evidence they've gathered against him.
And speaking about that alleged domestic violence, does the fact that Harshita was reportedly a domestic violence victim impact the way prosecutors may approach this case?
I mean, it certainly should have impacted the way in which they approached protecting her. I mean, my understanding, again, from information I've read about the case, is that she had reported to the police being a victim of domestic violence. We have over here, specialist provisions for dealing with domestic violence, including something called a domestic violence protection order, which is in fact a civil order which police can go and obtain to try to take steps against what is usually, obviously sometimes it can be a woman, but usually a male suspect of domestic violence, to prevent him from having contact with the potential victim, take him out of the matrimonial home, and take other steps to protect the victim. And I think, there are concerns that in this case, that application I think was made, or certainly it was considered, and I think there are concerns in this case that appropriate steps were not taken by the police in order to protect the victim, and obviously consequently led to her death.
What are the biggest challenges in convicting someone of murder when there's no direct eyewitness testimony?
I mean, that's a very good question, and of course, each case is different on its facts. But I mean, ordinarily, in investigating crimes of this nature, what used to be termed the perfect murder doesn't really exist in the modern world, because, police forensic investigation techniques are now so advanced, and so tracing DNA and other means of forensically identifying suspects. Also, I think CCTV more than anything. I mean, CCTV is everywhere. It's not just on the streets and public buildings, but also on people's doorbells. So quite often when murder investigations are being undertaken, the police will go knocking on all the relevant doorbells and take all the ring. We have something over here called Ring doorbell. I imagine you have a similar thing where people have video on their doorbells, and so it's much easier for the police now, who always dedicate a lot of resources in murder investigations, to get together the relevant evidence. I mean, again, we also have telecommunication evidence. So messaging, text messages, WhatsApp messages, and other material which is taken from telephones and other
Now, we spoke a
devices.
little bit about extradition earlier. What steps do UK authorities need to take formally, to formally request Mr. Lamba's extradition if they do locate him?
Well, that's also a good question. The first step is to charge him, which they've now done. So he's now been formally charged with her murder and other offences. And he is therefore wanted as a suspect and will be required. And as soon as he came into the country, if he came in of his own accord, for example, he'd be arrested immediately at the airport and taken into custody and brought before a court. Otherwise, a formal request is made of the exporting government, if you like, whether that be India or another country. And usually there are agreements, extradition agreements between countries. And so we in Britain used to be a member of the European Union. And we still have the same arrangement we did have when we were within the European Union with European Union countries. And they are something we call over here Tier 1 arrest warrants. We have a very reliable extradition agreement with the United States, and I'm sure as you probably know, frequently suspects are extradited to the US from the UK and vice versa. India and other countries, we have as I say, a formal extradition agreement with India. I think it's slightly less effective, and I think there have been complaints on both sides. But I would imagine that, given the diplomatic ties and long-standing relationship between the two countries, that in a case like this, which is really quite high profile, and people will be expecting this man to be brought to justice, I'm sure that the authorities in India will do everything they can to locate him. And once he has been located, then one would imagine extradition would be relatively simple once the formal request has been made.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, how long can an extradition process take?
Well, that's a very good question too. I mean, some of them can go on for years. I mean, there was
Wow.
quite a there was quite a famous case, wasn't there, recently, in which the US had sought the extradition of a British suspect for a fraud investigation, I think of which he was subsequently acquitted. I can't remember his name, but that went on for a number of years because there can be challenges. Certainly over here, you've got the European Court of Human Rights, and a lot of these challenges tend to go through the courts, and those processes can take quite a long time. I mean, in my experience of these kinds of situations involving subcontinental countries, perhaps the systems of protection in those countries and the ability of suspects to challenge maybe slightly less developed, and that accordingly sometimes those processes can be quicker.
And this next question, I'm just wondering, but it doesn't sound like it. Are there any legal loopholes that Mr. Lamba could use to delay or avoid extradition?
Again, a slightly difficult question for me to answer without having a sort of more of an in-depth knowledge of Indian extradition process and law. I mean, imagine there are, and I imagine that as there is in any situation, I imagine that he will try to take advantage of them, and he will have lawyers in India seeking to prevent extradition. But I imagine he would be extradited back here quite quickly if he's identified and brought into his custody.
Right. And if he is captured and stands trial in the UK, what kind of defense strategy could his legal team use, do you think?
Well, that rather depends on his instructions and the evidence. And so, I mean, if, for example, it was proven through, or there was a very, very strong case forensically that he was responsible for the murder, then he could put forward a defence of diminished responsibility, which means that by virtue of a sort of psychiatric failing, he was unable to understand the true meaning of what he was doing. He could say that he acted in self-defense. I'm just putting forward, potential defences, that he was attacked by her and that he killed her in self-defence because he had no other choice. There is a slightly more limited defence to murder, which is called provocation. And so, he can say that he was provoked to such an extent that he lost his sense of self-control. All of those defence is bar of self-defence defence, but diminished responsibility and provocation wouldn't provide a complete defence to him. What they would do is provide a defence to murder, but allow the jury to return a verdict of manslaughter, which would mean, effectively speaking, whilst he was responsible for the death, he didn't intend to bring it about. But that would take away the obligation on the court to impose a life sentence on him. So it gives the judge discretion on sentence.
And I just have to ask you this one last question before I let you go. If Harshita's family wanted to pursue civil action against, Mr. Lamba or his parents, would they have any legal standing in the UK?
Her parents, well, that yes, there's no reason why she. I mean, the act, if you like, has a nexus to the UK, so there's no reason why they couldn't bring civil proceedings in this country, seeking seeking damages for what took place. I mean, the question as to whether that would be a wise course of events would depend upon whether or not they'd be able to enforce any award of damages. So whether or not there were any assets over here, for example, that would be within the reach of the court in the event that they obtain justice. Because plainly, obviously, if he was convicted of murder, then their case would be an open and shut one from a civil perspective.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really, really appreciate it. This is a story
Thank you very
that
much
we
for
will
having
be
me.
following closely.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
According to Sky News, despite no one still being able to find him, Pankaj Lamba has been charged with his wife's murder. He's also been charged with 2 counts of rape, sexual assault, and controlling or coercive behavior. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.